Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. I want to pick up where I left off last time with the interview of Professor Larry Hurtado. And this hour of the podcast, we're going to reflect upon his view of textual criticism and how to respond to Bart Ehrman and other people who make, you might call, sensational claims, but also his views on the authorship of the New Testament and whether or not that affects whether or not the text is authoritative. So let's listen in. Here we go. I'll switch gears to something else, topic upon which you're certainly a specialist and have written a lot of material on. That's textual criticism. You know, of course, Bart Ehrman, I've done some podcasts on him, my audience. If you don't know Bart Ehrman, he is well-respected. But from my audience, at least, if you're not familiar with my audience, podcast listeners, he's a well-respected New Testament scholar. His specialty is really textual criticism, but he's in work and other things as well. And Bart, of course, was a devout Christian, and as he says, he had a deconversion. And so he writes a lot of literature, not just in scholarship, but he writes a lot of literature to the public. And because of that, Bart has brought textual criticism to the public. And people, I think the average person doesn't know even how to spell textual criticism. Not being a slam, I mean, no one is even exposed to it. So I think Bart is a very good writer. I think he's a clear writer. And he brought to the public, but what he brought to the public isn't very controversial among scholars. Now, some points are, but in general, a lot of stuff he says isn't. But since they're ignorant about those kind of findings in textual criticism, it's shocking to them. For example, most Christians don't realize there are many or copious variants in the New Testament manuscripts. Bart loves to say there are more variants than there are words. You know, of course that's true, but a lot of average Christians don't realize we don't have the originals or the autographs, and even that's a problematic term, I know, but things like that people, when we study textual criticism, we know this is standard. But he does say things that textual critics can't possibly demonstrate. For example, he loves to say that we don't just have copies of the manuscript, we have copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. In other words, we don't know how many copies exist between when Paul wrote something and the copies we have. But nevertheless, that's one thing he loves to emphasize, is this almost numerous, almost countless amount of copies, which of course is a great way to, well, it's sensational. But he also says things like, we have every reason to assume that the earliest copies we do have are much worse than the later ones, because he would say those scribes would not have been professional. And he'll say, look at the manuscripts, the more we go back, there are more errors. Now, he doesn't usually articulate in debates and lectures and talks that the errors we find are still of usually the same kind, like spelling and so forth. But the point is, I know, and I'm not trying to diminish or vitiate his motivation, but I know these kind of things sell well, and not only because it's new to the public, but also when you make these kind of claims that we just have every reason to doubt it, we don't know what it really said, and so forth. I get a lot of questions from people all through my ministry and career, and that is, well, David, can I trust the Bible? Can I trust the New Testament? I saw Bart again on CNN, or I saw him on Stephen Colbert, or I read this book. And of course, Bart gets a lot of heat because he's one of the few scholars writing in the public square on this field. So he's not the only person who says these kinds of things, but because he's a lightning rod, because of his very, very top-selling books. But I'm curious, Professor, you've, of course, written and studied this in this field a lot, in textual criticism. How do you respond to these kind of things? How do you respond?
Well, first of all, as you say, I think that Bart, who I know personally, and I think we basically have a friendly relationship with each other, I respect a lot of the work that he's done. And I think that it's a kind of combination of both what we would call factual data, and then inferences from that data that are debated, right, at the very least. For example, yes, it's quite true that, and to some degree, I guess I have to say, I think there's a bit of rhetorical overkill, right, in some of the stuff that he does. Yeah, okay, it's quite true that there are, thousands, perhaps, I don't know, tens of thousands of variants in the manuscripts that we have. Of course, it has to be pointed out that what we're talking about is several thousand manuscripts. So you should expect that there'd be several thousand variants if you have several thousand manuscripts. So that has to be said. Secondly, we're talking about variants in manuscripts that stretch across from let's say, roughly 200 A.D. or so, or perhaps a bit earlier, on down to the inventing of the printing press in the late Middle Ages. So we're talking about roughly, 1,200 years, and across 1,200 years and something like 5,000-6,000 Greek manuscripts alone, you would expect there to be a few variants, since it's all being done by hand. So that should not be so surprising. When you put it in context, you think, oh, okay, that's not so bad. But if you just say thousands of variants, it makes a great rhetorical point, but it doesn't really convey something of the reality of what we're talking about. Secondly, of those tens of thousands of variants, as Bart would recognize if you pressed him on it, about 99.599% are utterly insignificant things like, do you spell this word with an omicron or an omega, both of which make an O sound? Or do you spell this particular word with an epsilon, iota, or with just a iota, to use the Greek letter? So is Pilatos spelled with a iota, or is it Pilatos with a epsilon iota? In Koine Greek, they sound the same, and some scribes spelled it one way, and other scribes spelled it another way. Do you put the definite article with Jesus or not? So is it O Jesus here, or is it just Jesus? And some people, the custom often was to put the definite article with a proper name. But for other people, they obviously thought, yeah, but Jesus is so well known, we don't need to put a definite article with it. And so they either omitted it or added it. So these are minor things to say, 90, perhaps 95%, 99% of all of these variants are utterly insignificant, that make no difference whatsoever to what the text is saying. And if you were translating it, you would never know that there's any variant there because it makes no difference to the translation. There are some that are really interesting, are significant, but you can pretty well put them on both hands. I mean, for example, Bart's book that was so impressive in generating interest among scholars wider than text critics in textual criticism, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture.
Right.
If you read the preface, he says, I don't actually have a pattern of changes made. I'm picking up individual variants from various assorted manuscripts and putting them together here. And actually, I've probably got maybe a few score variants at most. Actually, not that many even, probably. But he himself would admit, I've only got a few score. Okay, 20, 30, 50, 60, maybe out of the tens of thousands of variants that we're talking about that make any difference whatsoever. And the really substantial ones, of course, are well known. The long, does Mark end at the King James Version ending, 1620? Does it end, as most of us tend to think, at 16:8? So are those 12 verses in the King James Bible likely to be part of the earliest form of Mark or not? Are the pericope, or the story of the adulterous woman, which appears in the medieval text in John chapter 8, is that a part of the original text or not? Because it's not there in the earliest manuscripts. It seems to pop in sometime in the 5th century and thereafter, and a few other verses, smaller references. But you can, as I say, you can almost put the ones that are worth talking about pretty much on the fingers of both hands. And even those major ones. I mean, if you read John with or without the pericope of the adulterous woman, does it make any difference to what Christian faith consists in? I don't think so.
I know.
If you read the Gospel of Mark with a long ending or with a short ending, does it make any difference to your understanding of Christian faith? I don't think so. So when people say, can I trust the Bible? Yeah, you can trust the Bible. It's a fairly good, accurate reflection of what Paul and the other figures wrote. And given that it had to be transmitted one pen stroke at a time across the years and across the centuries, I think it's bloody impressive. We have more resources for restoring the text of the New Testament than we do for any other text of antiquity. If classical scholars applied the same kind of critical negativity toward the textual situation of classical texts that Barth tries to advocate in some of his more sensational moments with regard to the New Testament. Classics departments would have to close up, because in most cases, you have one or two or three medieval copies of some classical text. And in the case of New Testament writings, we have thousands of copies, to say, including quite a number that go back to the 5th century, to the 4th century, and for certain writings, quite a number of at least fragmentary portions of New Testament writings that take us back to perhaps 200, perhaps 175 or so A.D., within roughly 100 years or a little more than 100 years of their composition. So in proximity, in numbers, we have nothing really like that for any other text. The other thing to say is that I, for example, supervised recently a doctoral student who completed 2 or 3 years ago. And what he did was to take all of the fragmentary and the 2nd and 3rd century manuscripts of the New Testament writings are all fragmentary, unfortunately. They don't survive intact. But to take the fragmentary manuscripts of the Gospel of John, which is the best represented, most frequently represented amongst these papyri, and to compare, to study their text closely, and to look at what kind of variants do we see among these about 17 or 18 fragmentary copies of the Gospel of John dated from the 2nd and 3rd century. And what kind of variants do they have? What kind, particularly in comparison with later manuscripts? And actually what he showed is that the incidence of variants that we have is no greater, and indeed looks as though it's less frequent than amongst some of the 4th and 5th century copies of the Gospel of John. And admittedly, these are, fragments, so we have only portions of John that are preserved, but they are in some sense random portions, right? They happen to survive. Nobody deliberately chose them. And so, random data, if you know social science, random data is actually more persuasive than selected data. And so in these randomly surviving portions, the impression that you get from this test case in the case of the Gospel of John is that you don't have a wild and chaotic handling of the text, but a fairly careful transmission of the text with, yes, some variations. Most of them seem to be sort of accidental copying errors, which you can easily recognize. In a few cases, maybe some deliberate changes. Say somebody will say, I'm going to change this, for whatever reason, they change a present tense verb into a future tense verb, or a singular into a plural verb, or whatever. But, it doesn't terribly affect the meaning of the text. So it's, where we've been able to test the data, the impression we get is very encouraging. And so, in reply to the copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies,
right.
Yes, if you take the 1,200-year span or 1,400-year span in which the New Testament was copied, yes, you have copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. But if you simply take the time span between, for example, the composition of the Gospel of John, let's say somewhere 90 A.D. or so maybe, and the earliest copies that we have, which are fragmentary copies from, say, 200, somewhere between 175 to 275, 300 in that period. So within 100 to 150 years of the composition of the book, from what we know, there would have been multiple copies made, but multiple copies made simultaneously, because the text was distributed far and wide. So yes, lots of copies of these biblical writings were made, because early Christians were textual maniacs about copying their texts and sending them hither, thither, and yon. But if we're talking about a kind of vertical descent from the original text to the earliest copies that we have from the late 2nd, early 3rd century, we're probably not talking about, copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies.
Right.
We know that manuscripts, papyrus manuscripts of this period, easily survive for 2 or 3 centuries or more. We know that from libraries that have been discovered, where we know how old the manuscript is sitting in the library, and in some cases have been sitting there for 200, 300, 400 years. So papyrus manuscripts were not, contrary to popular belief, were not the fragile little things that could fall apart easily. They're pretty tough puppies. And so as I say, the general impression you get is from this early period when there was no ecclesiastical control, no powerful bishops who could direct and prevent and burn and confiscate. Texts were simply being freely copied by individuals on their own. And yes, they aren't necessarily professional scribes or beautiful calligraphers. They're workaday copies. But the interesting thing is that when you compare them one with another, they're pretty much alike. And the amount of variation is relatively insignificant. So the general impression you get is that the most Christians of the time were interested in a fairly faithful transmission of the text precisely because it was the text that was sacred to them. So I think that a lot of, let me put it this way. Barth's main audiences are 2. He writes stuff that must be very comforting and consoling to fellow atheists, because it helps them to say, I'm justified in my atheism.
Right.
But also, his other main audience, which actually probably brings him in as much attention or more than anything else, is, sorry to use the term, but, fundamentalist Christians.
Absolutely. I've said that. Right, absolutely.
Who think that the King James Bible is exactly the inspired Word of God, word for word, that came from the mouth of God.
Right.
And who think that if there's any textual variation in the New Testament, then it's bogus, who have more of a Quranic view of the Bible, if I may say so. Barth has enormous traction with such people. And a lot of what he writes is directed against those kinds of conceptions, which I would like to join him in helping to disabuse people of.
Right.
But the way he goes about it is, deliberately provocative, deliberately pugnacious, and he gets lots of readers. Therefore, I mean, his supporters read him, and his enemies read him,
and the haters. That's right.
And so it's a win-win situation. It's great.
Right.
But it's a bit of posturing, and it's a bit of rhetorical posturing that's going on that I think is kind of over-egging at times. And if you just do a sober analysis of the data, sensational little.
Right.
The sensational bit, if anything, the sensational bit is that, wow, we have copies, or at least fragmentary copies, of New Testament writings from within perhaps 100 years or so of their composition, in the case of the Gospel of John and the other Gospels, and multiple copies. That's the point. We don't just have one copy from this period. We have multiple copies from this period. And therefore, you can use multiple copies to check one another. And when you use them to cross-check one another, you come up with a pretty stable text. Sorry, but that's the way it is.
That's just the way. Sorry. What do you think about Tertullian's claim? I can't remember now. I'm going by memory. Tertullian, who claimed in one of his works that he's speaking about the documents, and he says, "Go see for yourself. Go look in the churches where these texts are still held." He seems to imply either the original or a very, very early copy are still in the churches. I don't remember the claim now.
Yeah.
Would you find that just merely apologetic or so forth? I mean, I've thought of this for years. I don't know why he would make up such a claim or challenge unless he assumes the person really wouldn't go do it, unless he really is telling the truth. But what do you think about that? Do you think that'd be likely that in the early church, because it seems to me it's very likely that in the early church they would have held some kind of these sacred texts as prominent, and so when the Corinthians got their letter or the Romans got their letter, whatever house church ended up in, it just seems likely to me that the quote-unquote original would have stuck around for a while, and that would have been the master copy that people would have used as the baseline. Is that, and that Tertullian seems to support that. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think there's a good likelihood, it's a very plausible situation. First of all, I think that as far as Tertullian, when he says, go to our churches and you will see, ancient copies of these texts, I think he honestly believed what he wrote. Now, the issue is, okay, was he mistaken or not? But I don't think he was blowing smoke. I think he actually, he knew that churches had sort of master copies of these texts, which he believed, in some cases at least, were very ancient. And that was his belief, in other words. I think he was being honest, and therefore expected that, the pagan critics to whom he was writing might go to a church and say, so show me these things. And he was prepared to do it, I think. I don't think he was blowing smoke. Now the question is, well, how early were these copies that he's talking about? How likely is it that they may have been, an early copy of the Epistle to the Romans, or a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy? And no, I think from the 3rd century BC, in Alexandria in particular, and elsewhere we know, people were concerned to get the best original copy, the earliest copy, and the most reliable copy they could of the classical text, for example, of Homer or of the other classical writers. We know that people scoured throughout the Mediterranean. Scholars kings sent about, asking for the most reliable copies of important texts, from which were then held in libraries, like in the Great Library at Alexandria, and from which then people could come in and make copies from that master copy, which for their own purposes or for selling or for whatever. Given that cultural practice that had been in place for over 300 years, and Jews bought into it, Jews as well, were very concerned about the careful copying of their texts. Of course, Jewish biblical manuscripts exhibit variants as well, but there's no question that they regarded their texts as sacred, and that there was also a concern to transmit them with some care. So given that cultural attitude is out there, it's very plausible to think that Christians would have been shaped by their cultural setting just as everybody else is, and would have regarded their sacred texts as something to be treated with care. Justin says, writing in the middle of the 2nd century, that when come into our churches and you will find people read from the memoirs of the apostles, probably meaning the Gospels, and this is a regular feature of church worship. So this is an important factor, that these texts were not simply passed about, the way a newspaper is, or a magazine, or even a book. They were texts that were held and used in churches, held and used collectively, used as part of the corporate worship exercise of the church. So of course the church would have wanted to get a reliable copy, and of course they would have treated that copy with care, and would not have allowed it to be monkeyed with. And when a text was read and reread and read and reread, a congregation after a while would have known pretty much what a text was supposed to say, and it would have been much more difficult to make any significant changes in that text, or the congregation would have recognized it. So there are various forces and factors that I think would have constrained what people would have done. And yes, I think that it's quite likely that churches would have held particularly in major centers such as Rome and Antioch and other places, they would have held master copies of New Testament texts, from which then other copies would be made for distribution. We have reference, for example, in the letter of Polycarp, who refers to, he says, he refers to letters of Ignatius that he has collected, and it's sending copies of the letters of Ignatius that he's collected to this other church. So the great book by Harry Gamble called Books and Readers in Early Christianity. Highly recommend the book. It's absolutely essential reading for anybody who's interested in early Christianity. It's a very readable book and a very well-informed book. And one of the things that Gamble shows is that from sometime at least in the early 2nd century, somewhere between 100 and 150, that there are what he refers to as Christian copy centers that are opening up in places like Antioch and Rome, where we know that people were making copies of text for then sending out to other churches for translocal distribution. So that means you had to have a master copy of the text from which reliable copies then could be made. So it wasn't a kind of willy-nilly, wild and woolly sort of, stuff, a text just floating around in the atmosphere. This is a much more deliberative process that involved probably the collecting and establishing of a reliable, what was judged to be by the local church, a reliable master text from which then subsequent copies could be made. And I think Tertullian is reflecting that and believes that in some cases, perhaps, you have maybe what he thinks might be the original copy, or at least a very reliable facsimile of the original copy.
So, absolutely. What do you do then with the fact that we don't know what Matthew, I'll say Matthew and Luke for shorthand, whoever the authors are for Matthew and Luke, they obviously thought Mark's gospel was special, or they would not have cited, 93% or whatever it is of it. But if they thought it was scripture, they didn't have a problem rewording Mark. And so if we say the earliest manuscripts, earliest copies considered it scripture, and I know you make arguments about because it was used, there are evidences that they consider it scripture and special, for example, using the codex form and so forth. But obviously thinking that it's scripture doesn't mean they feel compelled not to change a word of it. If you think that Matthew and Luke thought Mark was scripture, because they don't have a problem changing Mark's, those so-called Q and other places, not Q, but where they disagree against them. What do you do with that? So obviously they can think it's special, but maybe clean up Mark's Greek here and there and things like that, or disagree against him. Does that have anything to do with an implication of later copyists?
There are two different processes that we have to distinguish. Okay. One is the copying of a text, and the second one is the composition of a new text. Okay. Matthew and Luke are not copying Mark. They're not giving versions of Mark. They're creating a wholly new text in which they clearly, it seems to most of us, they clearly saw Mark as an inspirational model and as a major source text, so to speak, for their text. So they incorporate huge amounts. In the case of Matthew, he virtually, incorporates almost the entirety of Mark into his book. But of course, anybody who looks at Matthew and Mark will recognize Matthew is considerably larger. He's not giving a version of Mark. He's writing a whole new text with huge amounts of sayings material added, birth narrative added, resurrection appearances added, and so on. So I've described the Gospels as different renditions of the Jesus story, or different renditions of the Jesus book. And Matthew and Luke are independent authors who are doing their own rendition of the Jesus story. They're not doing a rendition of Mark. They're doing a rendition of the Jesus story, drawing upon Mark as inspiration and major resource. A similar kind of thing in the 2nd century, we have things like the so-called Egerton fragment, which I think likewise is a fresh composition. Somebody sitting down and deciding, I want to write my own account, my own version of things. The other apocryphal Gospels, the narrative apocryphal Gospels, are again fresh compositions. They aren't copies of the canonical Gospels. They're fresh compositions which often betray a familiarity with the familiar canonical Gospels and drawing upon them for resources, but for the purpose of creating a new text. So I don't think that we can extrapolate from what the authors of Matthew and Luke do with Mark to what copyists would have done in the process of copying any of these texts. They're two entirely different conventions. Copyists, in the ancient world, the job of the copyist is to copy, not to monkey about with the text. Copyists copy as best they can. Some of them are not very good at it and make oodles of mistakes. For example, one of the familiar texts that we have from about 200 or so is this papyrus copy of the Gospel of John, known amongst, the crew as P66. Papyrus Bodmer II. And this is a copy of basically the first 14 chapters of the Gospel of John. That's what we have, 14 chapters of the Gospel of John. And it's got about 500 accidental mistakes in it. I kid you not. The reason we know that there are these mistakes is that the same copyist then sat down and double-checked his work against the exemplar that he was copying against and corrected himself in about 500 places.
Wow.
So on the one hand, we say, well, so what is this? People have said, oh, well, this was a sloppy scribe who didn't care much about how carefully he copied. No, he was very careful about what he wanted to do. He just wasn't very good at it.
Here we go.
But so he went through, the first time through, he screwed up badly. He dropped words, overlooked words, did all kinds of mistakes. But he was so conscientious that he then sat down and proof-checked his work against the exemplar and caught about 400 or 500 places where he made a mistake and made the correction in the text. That sounds to me like a pretty conscientious copyist.
Conscientious.
Wasn't terribly talented, but he was very conscientious. So copyists copy. They don't freely recompose a text. Readers, users of text, can make changes in a text, the way you might make a marginal note in some book that you own. And if that were a manuscript and then it was copied, your copyist might say, ooh, copy everything. So he might incorporate your marginal note into the text. But the copyist doesn't introduce new stuff. Readers and users of text can make changes in the text, which I think largely account for a number of the what seem to be intentional variants in the text of the New Testament. But again, I hasten to emphasize, we have oodles of copies, including a good number of early copies, which were made all independently of one another, right? And so that allows us to catch, if one guy makes a deliberate change in the text, we got 3, 4, 5, or 15 other copies of the text from approximately the same period, copied independently. And if that guy makes some significant change in the text, it stands out like a sore thumb, because we've got other copies by which we can check it. So we aren't in the perilous situation that some people think we are, and that some people make out that we are. But
and invariably, go ahead.
Again, as I say, the process of composing a text, if you're an author of a text, you have the God Almighty right to do whatever you want to with it. And if you're drawing upon some text and using it as a source in the ancient world, of course, you tended to use sources without acknowledging them. You just incorporate whatever. That looks good, I'll incorporate that. And you build it into your text. But that's a different process from the process of transmitting a text, copying it.
That's a very good point. Invariably when it comes to copying text, another issue that is, just almost always accompanies that issue is the issue of authorship. What do you do with texts like the pastorals and 1 and 2 Peter? I know in scholarship, my audience here in the podcast may not realize that we typically call those the inauthentic or the at least debatable whether Paul wrote the pastoral epistles, 1, 2 Timothy and Titus and 1, 2 Peter. There are other texts, maybe perhaps some other texts that come under criticism of not being written, so having a false author, and so we call them pseudepigraphic. And then people who believe in a particular view of inspiration of the text, for them this is highly problematic, because if Peter did not write 1 and 2 Peter, let's go to the most commonly held one that he didn't write, which is, say, 2 Peter. Any one you want to pick out, what do we do with that? Is it true that the texts can't be trusted if their purported author did not write them? So what would you say to the person who finds that very scary? Well, first off, I guess, do you find any of these texts that are probably written by under a false name? And secondly, if you do, what would you say to a person to either encourage them or respond to them of whether or not we still can trust this as an authoritative text for the Christian?
Well, as I've said to students often, I don't have any magical ways of determining whether a text is so-called pseudonymous, that is written under the name of someone else, or not. I don't have any magical ways of doing that. The only ways I have of doing that are the methods that we use for any text, for determining whether any text is from the author that it claims to be or not. And so, you do the standard sort of drill. You say, well, if you have a body of text by a given author. I mean, people argue over the plays of Shakespeare. Did Shakespeare write all of them, or were some of them written by someone else? Same kind of thing. What we do is we say, well, do we have works that we have, absolute assurance that these really come from the guy? And then we say, okay, well, let's look at the vocabulary. Let's look at the way in which he constructs sentences, other kind of, stylistic and literary features. And then let's compare those with the grammatical vocabulary features of this text that is in doubt and see, do they match up or not? And if they don't, then you think, okay, maybe that means that this isn't actually by this guy, because it doesn't have the same sort of grammatical pattern or lexical pattern that we have in the assured works. Another way that we look at it is, if a text seems to reflect a situation or an event that is later than the lifetime of the author, if a text does that, then we say that's an anachronism. That this text refers to an event that we know happened well after the death of this author, so he can't have written that. Or it refers to a situation or a development that is that seems to be, based on what else we know, that seems to post-date the author's life, then it's unlikely that he could have written that because it reflects a situation that's far later than his own lifetime. So those are the kinds of things that people do, and those are the kinds of tests that people employ in looking at writings like 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Peter, and so on. And yes, it does look as though I'm satisfied that there are reasons to doubt the Pauline authorship of the pastoral letters, and to doubt the Petrine authorship of either 1 Peter or 2 Peter, for example. Certainly 2 Peter. And, in the case of Ephesians as well, there are reasons to wonder whether Paul really wrote that letter or not for these bases. Now, you can always say, well, okay, but couldn't this author have varied his vocabulary so considerably for this other writing? Yes. It's a judgment. All I'm saying is that if we use the criteria that we ordinarily use to try to establish authentic authorship or pseudonymous authorship, it does look to me in the case of several writings in the New Testament that we have a basis for saying, I think there's a good possibility that this author didn't write this text, a good possibility that it's pseudonymous. So I just have to go with that kind of judgment. Now, what do I make of that? Well, the first thing to say is, of course, not all texts in the New Testament are pseudonymous. You still have the number of pseudonymous texts in the New Testament is actually, you can count them pretty much on one hand. The four Gospels are anonymous texts. They don't claim to be written by a particular author. So if, for example, the Apostle John didn't write the Gospel of John, that's not an error on the part of the text. That's an error in Christian tradition. The authors of the four Gospels weren't interested in telling us their names. And that's interesting because it means that they didn't think of themselves as writing as authors, as creative or fictive authors, but they thought of themselves, it appears, as just serving the common interests of the Christian body that they were part of, affirming a kind of corporate held body of traditions. So that's interesting. So they're not pseudonymous. And so that extends to the four Gospels and Acts. At least 7 of the letters that are attributed to Paul in the New Testament are by common consent virtually undoubted by scholars as authentic. So there's another 7 writings. The book of Revelation claims to be written by a prophet named John, and virtually everybody agrees, this was the guy's name, John. Not necessarily the Apostle John, but there was a guy named John who was this prophet who wrote this book. Notice the author doesn't claim to be an apostle. He simply claims to be the prophet John. So on and on we go like that. There's a good body of texts in the New Testament that, and 1, 2, and 3 John, again, the author doesn't claim to be John. We call him 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. That's church tradition. Those likewise are anonymous writings. So the number of writings that we have to worry about are small, pastoral letters, 2 Peter, not really major things. And the critical mass of writings in the New Testament they have left is quite substantial. which escape the charge of being pseudonymous. So you say, well, okay, if it bothers you, you say, I can't trust a text that's pseudonymous. Okay, you still have a body of, you have still 4 Gospels, the Book of Acts, you have 7 letters of Paul, you have the Book of Revelation, you have 1, 2, 3 John. At the very least, you have those that are not pseudonymous. And therefore, if your criterion for what you trust is pseudonymity or not pseudonymity, you still get a significant body of text that you can treat as scripture if you want to work that way. My own approach, though, is to say, how do we know that just because a text is pseudonymous, it's untrustworthy? How do we know that it's not to be trusted in anything simply because an author followed a convention, which is a widespread convention in the ancient world, of ascribing a text to some famous guy? That's a practice that's done by Jews, by Christians, by lots of people in the ancient world. How do we know that a text is totally reprehensible in every respect simply because the genuine author chose to ascribe it to some other famous guy from the past? It's a non sequitur. We don't know that that's the case. And, you say, well, if you think that God providentially guided the church in the collecting of writings to form the New Testament, then okay. If God was cool with having pseudonymous writings incorporated into the New Testament, who the devil are you to object? Seriously, if you believe that the New Testament was put together providentially, then it means, based as best as we can judge it, it appears that God providentially wanted these texts to be included as well. So if the providence of God, saw that these things must come in part of the New Testament, okay. But as I say, if it really bothers you, no, I can't trust the pseudonymous text, then okay, ignore the pseudonymous text. You still have a body of text in the New Testament, quite a substantial body of text in the New Testament, treated as scripture.
Right. So there is ancient evidence of the letters being synonymous, of the letters, the genre of letter being under a false name. I don't remember learning that. That's news to me. I mean, I know they write false names of other literature.
The letter of
What's that?
Aristeas, we don't know whether a guy named Aristeas actually wrote those letters. We have fictive letters ascribed to Ignatius of Antioch. A well-known problem there as to how many of the letters that are ascribed to Ignatius actually written by him, by common scholarly, widespread, not universal, but by widespread scholarly consent. 7 of the letters that are ascribed to Ignatius are actually by him, but there's another half dozen or so in the larger collection that most people think are probably pseudonymous. So pseudonymous letters, pseudonymous texts are not that unusual. People, as well as, pseudonymous apocalypses and pseudonymous gospels, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Bartholomew, all of these are clearly pseudonymous writings produced by people who wanted to make some kind of, in their mind, contribution, to some sort of thing. So pseudonymity, ascribing text to some famous person, is a way of commending the text. And it appears as though there were people who thought, gee, this text that I've written is so important. I want to make sure that it really gets people's attention. Well, one of the ways you do that today maybe would try to get it on the Oprah show or something, and get noticed. But one of the ways you would do it in the ancient world is to ascribe it to some famous person that would give it a certain amount of legs with a certain readership.
And for you, for the average person, well, I'm right away thinking, of course, of Bart and the book Forged and so forth. If someone did that deliberately to get a readership, he and others would say, and a lot of atheists would say, of course, well, that means they're lying. That's false, and they're lying. If they're lying, then that's a big no-no. We shouldn't trust it.
Well, again, I think that actually in that kind of argument, once again, Bart is actually using the assumptions of the fundamentalists that he loves to goad against them. The logic in that case to say if the author has ascribed, if the true author has ascribed the text to someone else, then he has lied. And if he has lied about that, then the whole text is worthless. Mm-hmm. that is based on a premise of a kind of, all or nothing biblical inerrancy. If a single word is wrong, then the whole text is untrustworthy. That kind of all or nothing domino theory inerrancy point of view ironically, is the basis on which Barth is actually mounting that kind of argument. And it can be very effective for people who hold that kind of all or nothing sort of view. What I'm saying is, I think it is a non sequitur. I think it is a fallacy to think that if an author, for whatever reason, ascribes his text to some famous person fictitiously, that everything in the text is a bunch of hype. That's just simply a non sequitur. It does not follow. The contents of a text deserve to be examined in their own right as to whether they are edifying, whether they accord with Christian tradition, whether they seem to have functioned well and productively in the history of Christian faith. Are they destructive? Are they contributory to Christian faith or not? So if an author happened to ascribe his writing to somebody, let's say the author or authors of the pastoral letters, it is widely thought, ascribed their text to Paul because they believed that they were heirs of Paul. They believed that they were writing in the tradition of Paul, and they wanted Paul to be around to, so to speak, the voice of Paul to speak to a later generation. So they ascribed their text to him. Okay, if that's so, they committed they gave it a fictive name. And if you think that that's lying, okay, that's lying. I mean, I think that's probably a harsh way of putting it, but the question then remains, okay, but are the contents of these writings worthwhile? Are they to be treated as heresy, or I don't know, some kind of total negativity, or do they have some valuable content? So I think it's a non sequitur, in other words, and the argument, this is a pseudonymous writing, therefore it's all a bunch of hooey, is an argument that has traction really only with a fundamentalist view of the Scripture. And a lot of atheists are in fact crypto-fundamentalists.
Absolutely. Crypto-fundamentalists. That's absolutely. This reminds me, Professor, when I think about this kind of stuff, as you were saying these kind of things, and as I've recommended your works, and I've said these things to people as well, I get encouraged, of course, when I think about the average Christian who is bombarded with people like Bart Ehrman and other when it comes to these sensational claims. And I just wish more biblical specialists and theologians were in the public square more often. And I think of people like a Dan Wallace. He's one of the few people I know of that debates Bart on these particular issues, and some others that have debated him particularly. And I'm not talking about, I don't like debate just for the sake of debate, but I think there's great value in having people who are specialists in the field address this in the particular, areas they feel comfortable doing it. But why do you think that's the case? Why do you think it's the case that so many biblical specialists, and we could spout out all kinds of names, but why do you think they're not in the public that much? And I just doubt it's just because they're all shy. And I know a lot of people, they might say, well, David, that's not what I want to do. And that's fine. I'm not saying they have to do it, but particularly Christian biblical scholars, and a lot of people in my audience in the podcast might be surprised to hear that not all biblical specialists or historians are Christians or believers. But those that are, why do you think that is, that we have what seems to be a dearth of people addressing these kind of popular level things? I think very quickly in the ancient world, you have Justin Martyr and Letter Diognetus and all these, they responded. I mean, down the list, like we talked about earlier, these were, I might call Christian preacher scholars, even all the way to Augustine. We have people who worked in the academy and the church, and they addressed all kinds of issues to help equip Christians on these kind of challenges. What do you say to that?
Well, I think I would first of all, I think I would correct, if I may, your assumption. I think that there are scholars, professing Christian scholars, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, of various stripes, who do try to engage some of these questions about the meaning of Christian faith, the validity of Christian faith, and who do answer or try to engage some of the sorts of issues that we've been talking about. And, some of them you mentioned Dan Wallace. I think, people like Craig Evans, people like Michael Bird, and of course, perhaps one of the most successful, perhaps the only person who, in merchandising terms, perhaps rivals friend Bart in terms of volume of sales, is Tom Wright. So you do have people who
right. There are some, sure, there are some,
engage these things. The problem, or a problem, is that not to say anything against any of the people I've named, but as you indicated early on, Bart is an exceptionally bright, articulate guy who's able to put across himself both orally and in writing. If you've ever seen him speaking and so on, he's very, very good. He was a high school debater, as I was, and he's very, very good on his feet and thinking on his feet, and writes in a very clever kind of way. And I don't know. I envy, I have to say, his success and whatever his secret was in getting his publisher to promote his book the way they have, and he must have a literary agent perhaps who promotes his stuff. He's been enviably successful as a mercantile operation. And part of it is that he's very good at communicating, articulate, both in orally and in writing, as is Tom Wright in particular. Likewise, Tom is an amazingly articulate guy. If you've ever seen him in public, he can think on his feet, speak easily, writes fluently and easily. So not everybody has those talents who happen to be scholars, and so there's a certain sense in which they have acquired the kind of celebrity scholar status that they have, almost unique, I would say, those two in the field. They've both acquired that celebrity status in part because they have some of the attributes and traits for that, and they have dedicated themselves, it has to be said, to that. I think they've both aspired to be celebrity scholars and have the talents to do so, and have put them to use in that sense. So they've made a career decision to move in that direction and have the goods to do it. Not everybody does. The other thing is, not everybody who may have some abilities and so on of this kind happens to establish the connections. You have to have connections with a publisher, with a literary agent, whatever. It's almost like being struck by lightning. I mean, you can't predict that. You can try. You can stand out in the rain, in a thunderstorm. You can take a big metal rod and put it 50 feet in the air and hope that lightning will strike. And maybe it will and maybe it won't. I mean, I just published a book last year, this One Destroyer of the Gods, which I wrote for a kind of, a public that watches Discovery Channel or reads the New York Times, or as well as the Bible-believing people, for a wider public. The publisher hired a publicist to promote it. I've had a lot of attention from some radio interviews and podcasts and so on, and for a scholarly book, it's done reasonably well. As yet, Bart can sleep easily at night. Destroyer of the Gods is not going to knock him off the bestseller list. And Tom's free and clear. I'm not going to rival him. It would be nice, but it's a question of saying either combination of you don't have the goods, or you're not writing precisely the kind of thing that gets sensational. I mean, if you write a book called Forgery,
right.
or and you accuse or orthodox corruption of Scripture, what a great title!
What a great title! Yep.
The other day, however, a few years back, Bart came up to me at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature and grabbed me around the shoulders and said, "I've just been to the book display. I'm really vexed. You've stolen a title that I wanted to use for a book." And it was the title of the book was How on Earth Did Jesus Become a God?
Oh, right.
And he said, I wanted to use that title. And I said, well, Bart, you just got to be quicker off the mark. Well, of course, as you may know, 2 or 3 years ago, he did come out with a book called How Did Jesus Become God? Something like that.
Right.
So sort of a version of the same title. But I beat him to the punch. But still, he sold a heck of a lot more books with that than I did. And you might say, well, it's a combination of he's just a better writer, maybe. But also he certainly has far better connections than I did. And also, he happens to be saying in the book the kinds of things that a certain number of people in the modern kind of secularizing world want to hear.
Right, they have a hunger for it.
Yeah, there's a market out there.
Yeah.
Bart, as I say, the 2 big markets that I think Bart has are people who are secularizing people who want to be who've jettisoned or who want to avoid religious faith, Christian faith, sort of new atheism and other kinds of things that have come along in the wake of Dawkins and other such people, and who find fodder. Find Bart's books helpful fodder in reassuring them that they're justified in their rejection of Christian faith. In the same way that Christians might find apologetical works reassuring to their faith, atheists find Bart's book very reassuring for their non-faith. And that's a major part of his constituency, I think. And the other, however, major part, to judge from the invitations that he gets to speak, most of the invitations, I think, that he gets to speak are invitations from sort of evangelical fundamentalist places who want him to come in and put up a guy to debate with him. And Bart generates a lot of money. He tells me, by the way, that all of the money that he makes from speaking fees and from his blog site goes to charities that he supports.
I've heard him say that.
So he's a very, very, he doesn't keep it all for himself. But to judge from from what I hear are the invitations that he gets, they're characteristically to go speak in some conservative Christian place.
Right. Yeah, a church or something.
So that obviously is another constituency that he had. They love to hate Bart Ehrman.
That's right.
and Bart does okay by that. It's all right.
That's true. That's right. That's right.
And his charities do okay. I mean, he's generating a lot of money for his charities, so God bless him.
Right.
That's our sixth series.
Right.
God bless him.
Right. Absolutely. Right. Well, absolutely. What are you working on now and in the future? What are your goals? Speaking of book titles, what are some projects you're working on?
Well, the immediate projects that I'm working on are as they have been over the last several years. Again, I had to fight free to find time to write these 2 books over the last 2 years because I've been fulfilling a lot of commitments for writing essay contributions to this or that multi-author book or reference work or conference presentation. So I've got several of those things lined up that will take me clear at least halfway into 2018. But the other 2 big projects that I have of book-sized things is that I have 2 separate volumes of collections of my own essays that have been previously published over the years in journals or in various multi-author works that I'm gathering together. One of them is to be published by Bloomsbury T.M.T. Clark, and it's going to be a collection of my essays, about a dozen or so of my essays dealing with text critical questions and manuscript studies and things like that. And then Baylor University Press is publishing a much larger collection. It will be about 30 of my essays on early Christology, Jesus devotion, things like that. And so for each of these, I wrote a large introduction saying, where's this all coming from? How does it all fit together? How do these essays are written over the course of 25, 30 years fit into a meaningful pattern? And then editing them all and in some cases, trying to update them so that what will appear in the book form will be a somewhat updated version of the essay. So those are working through the press now, and over the next couple of months, 2 or 3 months probably, I will be getting the manuscripts. Of course, for each of these, you had to contact the original publishers, get permissions to republish the stuff, and find find the original Word files or PDFs and get them all scanned in and put together into a composite manuscript. So it's a big job. In both cases, fortunately, the two publishers are doing a lot of that legwork, and I will be given the composite manuscript soon for kind of final editing, with a view to the two coming out toward the end of this year.
Great. Are there any particular topics you feel like you haven't really explored enough yet that you want to take on outside of these collection of essays?
Well, the future things I want to do beyond the things that I've been commissioned to write for conferences and so on. I've got an essay, for example, that I'm due to prepare sometime in 2018, sometime in early 2018, on the view of Jesus that we have in the Gospel of Mark, so the Christology of Mark, for a multi-author volume that's going to have different perspectives on that. So this will be my chance to write about a 15,000-word piece on that. So that's one thing I'm looking forward to. I think I want to ponder further and explore further the question that I raised in the Marquette lecture: why on earth did anybody become a Christian in the first 3 centuries? And to ponder further what are the reasons that we can find or that we can infer for what motivated people to become a Christian when it was so unpopular to be one. Why would that have happened? And we can't write them off and say, well, they were all a bunch of low-life kooks. The sort of accusation that the critic Celsus makes, Christians are just a bunch of sort of vermin, uneducated, ignorant slobs who don't know better. We know that certainly by the 2nd century, and even earlier, I think, Christianity was beginning to attract the attention, favorable attention of people up into the social levels of Roman society. And that's why someone like Celsus devoted all of his energies to trying to refute Christianity. Because I think, from his standpoint, Christianity was making the wrong kind of converts of higher social standing, and that was a really threatening thing. So I want to try to explore that further. I'm not sure that I can write a book on the subject because I have to explore it still further. And there isn't a whole lot of precedent for it. But I think I'd like to explore that question further and see what might result.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Professor. This has been absolutely helpful. And these 2 different podcasts you've done with me now have been just very enlightening. And I hope that everybody, as I've continued to say on my podcast, will go check out your work. I know that a lot of it can be found on Amazon, correct? But just go to Amazon.com and put in Larry Hurtado. A long list of your works will come up. Where are some places would you encourage your people to start with Destroyer of the Gods, or just kind of depends on what they want to study?
Well, I think it depends on what they want. If somebody wants simply to say, if you're a Christian and you say, I'd like to look at my spiritual forebears, or you're not a Christian and you say, I'd like to know something about what this thing called Christianity started out like, probably Destroyer of the Gods would be an interesting place to start. It's intended for a wide readership. Okay. If a person is sort of interested more in questions about the origins of Jesus devotion, what were the earliest kinds of beliefs and things, maybe the little book, How on Earth Did Jesus Become a God, would be an interesting place to start. I'm talking about general readers now, people who want scholars in the field. Yeah. And for people who are, maybe a little more interested in saying, well, manuscripts and stuff like that. I'm not a textual scholar myself, but I just like to know more about what are we talking about there and what did they look like. Maybe my little book, The Earliest Christian Artifacts, would be something that I think would be accessible for people as well.
Absolutely, and I completely concur. I think your work is very accessible, and it's one of the reasons I'm glad to have you on the podcast, and I hope that in the future, as you continue to write your literature, and maybe in the future I'd love to have you on when you write and answer those good questions about why do they become a Christian and so forth. I'd love to follow up, and we'll continue to follow your work with good interest. And I really appreciate you taking the good time. And all the way from Kansas, I want to say thank you so much, and I'm sure my audience does as well.
All right. Good talking to you. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom. facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, and also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom, or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways to reach out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.